Step into the world of Edwardian Europe, a time of glittering chandeliers and silken gowns. On the surface, it was an era of unmatched elegance, where every detail, from the polished silver to the whispered conversations at grand balls, radiated perfection. But beneath this dazzling veneer lay a secret world, a world of hidden anxieties and quiet desperation. The pressure to maintain grace was immense. The elite turned to powdered remedies for a moment of calm, while strict social rituals demanded flawless performance. In this gilded cage, human hearts were often trapped between society's expectations and the simple need to survive. Addiction and reliance became silent companions in the pursuit of an impossible ideal. This was an age where the cost of beauty was a price no one dared to speak aloud. It began with elegance, with candlelight flickering across polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers reflecting a world that looked perfect from the outside. Edwardian Europe loved beauty, order, and appearances. Everything had to shine. The dresses were grand, layered with silk, lace, and shimmering embroidery, while towering crinolines gave women a regal presence that commanded attention the moment they entered a room. Men moved with equal confidence, dressed in immaculate coats and crisp collars, speaking with poise and assurance, as though their lives flowed effortlessly through comfort and luxury. This was a society that seemed blessed with charm, wealth, and grace. But within that glittering world lived pressures so heavy that not even diamonds could hide them. To belong to the elite was not simply to enjoy luxury. It was to perform endlessly. Every gesture mattered, every word needed to impress, every appearance demanded perfection. There were dinners that could not be refused, parties that stretched through the night, social gatherings where reputations were shaped and judged with silent precision. On the surface, the laughter seemed natural, the music joyful, and the atmosphere effortlessly radiant. Yet behind every graceful smile existed exhaustion, expectations, and unspoken anxieties. Society admired elegance, but rarely acknowledged the invisible burden required to maintain it. Many members of high society struggled quietly. The image of perfection came at a cost no one discussed openly. There were sleepless nights spent worrying about social standing. There were constant fears of losing reputation, respect, or influence. Women were expected to radiate endless charm, to never falter, to never show the emotional strain beneath their beautifully powdered faces. Men were expected to be strong, driven, decisive, and endlessly confident. Even when their responsibilities weighed heavily on them, everyone was required to keep performing, no matter how tired or overwhelmed they became. In the grand drawing rooms of Europe, the polished silence hid these truths. Beneath chandeliers, conversations sparkled with witty remarks and graceful laughter. Yet few dared to admit when they were sinking inside. People often sought relief in the only way society allowed them, quietly, discreetly, behind closed doors. Doctors provided remedies as part of normal medical practice, believing they were helping calm nerves, reduce strain, or restore lost rest. These treatments were discussed as respectable solutions, not as dangers. They were seen as modern science supporting the needs of a modern elite life. Society trusted these remedies because they came wrapped in respectability and medical approval. Bottles stood beside perfume on vanity tables. Tiny vials rested quietly in elegant drawers. To the outside world, they were simply part of lifestyle and health, a sign of refinement rather than risk. This illusion of safety made everything even more complicated. It blurred the line between necessity and dependence, between relief and reliance. People did not think they were risking anything. They simply believed they were maintaining the strength society demanded from them. Slowly and silently, dependency grew. The pressure to remain perfect never stopped, and with each passing year, life became more demanding. Parties became bigger, expectations grew heavier, and the emotional struggle deepened. Many began to feel trapped inside lives that looked beautiful but felt suffocating. Their worlds sparkled with chandeliers and jewels, but inside they battled fatigue, stress, and fear of failure. Still, they maintained their poise. That was the rule. No matter how exhausted they felt, they had to smile. But behind those smiles, subtle cracks formed. Some people could no longer sleep without help. Others struggled through the day without the support they had grown accustomed to. Conversations sometimes carried a hidden tremble beneath the confidence. Hands shook slightly beneath lace gloves. Bright eyes sometimes reflected more strain than joy. But society did not want vulnerability, it wanted beauty. So, people learned to hide their struggles better. Families, too, became silent witnesses of this growing fragility. Parents watched their children enter the same glittering world of expectations. Young women were raised to be elegant before they were even allowed to understand themselves. They were trained in posture, charm, and patience. Young men were shaped into leaders long before they understood how heavy responsibility could feel. And so, the cycle continued. The sparkling world lived on, unaware of the quiet emotional storms behind its polished walls. Yet, beneath all this silence existed something profoundly human: fear of judgment, longing for peace, a desire to breathe freely, and the hope to remain valued. Many people of Edwardian high society were not villains of indulgence. They were human beings trying desperately to withstand the weight of expectations placed upon them since birth. They were caught between appearance and reality, between glamour and emotional survival. Society saw perfection. History later saw the truth. This era was stunning, sophisticated, and unforgettable. It dazzled the world with its fashion, etiquette, and artistic brilliance. But it also carried a hidden loneliness, a fragile heartbeat beneath the music, and a quiet sadness beneath the laughter. It was a time when beauty ruled every room, yet no one dared to admit how much strength it took simply to keep standing beneath that splendor. And so, the glittering world continued shining, not because it was effortless, but because everyone inside it was too afraid to let the lights go dim. Beneath the silk gowns and polished smiles, a deeper story was unfolding, one not of luxury, but of struggle, silence, and human vulnerability wrapped inside elegance. The illusion of perfection in the Edwardian era didn't fade with time. Instead, it deepened. Those extravagant evenings became rituals, almost like rehearsed performances, where everyone knew their role, but no one dared question the script. From the outside, the sound of music drifting from a ballroom was enchanting, but for those inside, it often felt like a constant reminder of expectations they could never escape. Every gathering was more than just an event. It was a test of composure, of endurance, and of how convincingly you could pretend that everything was effortlessly wonderful. The drawing rooms glowed with warmth, filled with polished mahogany, velvet upholstery, and floral arrangements, carefully chosen to reflect status and taste. The women, dressed in exquisite silks and layered with jewelry, appeared radiant in the candlelight. Their hair was styled to perfection, their posture flawless, their voices gentle, charming, and endlessly accommodating. But behind this polished exterior, many were simply following the rules of survival. They lived in a society where a woman's worth was measured by her grace, her composure, and her obedience to social expectations. Strength wasn't defined as resilience of the mind. Strength was defined as keeping up appearances, no matter what weighed on your heart. Conversations floated through the air like silk ribbons, elegant, polite, and never too deep. People discussed fashion, travel, art, and politics, all spoken in carefully acceptable tones, alongside endless talk about social standing. Rarely did anyone say how they truly felt. Emotional honesty was considered dangerous. Vulnerability was treated like a flaw instead of a human truth. So, people learned to protect themselves with smiles instead of sincerity. Behind these carefully practiced smiles, life was anything but simple. Many aristocratic families were drowning in financial pressure, desperately trying to maintain a lifestyle that was far more fragile than it appeared. Estates that looked majestic were often burdened with crippling debt. Nobles who appeared confident in public often stayed awake through the night, worrying that their entire world was slowly slipping away. The facade demanded that everything appear permanent, grand, and unshakable. But reality whispered a much more uncertain story. Women, in particular, bore a different kind of silent struggle. Their lives were often confined to beauty, etiquette, and social duties. They were expected to be perfect daughters, graceful wives, flawless hostesses, and symbols of elegance for their families. Few were encouraged to express personal ambitions, dreams, or independence. Their minds carried questions they could not voice, and their hearts carried emotions they could not release. So they smiled, they laughed gracefully. They lived inside an invisible cage lined with velvet and jewels. During this time, doctors, who were highly respected and trusted, often spoke reassuringly about remedies meant to help people maintain calm, rest, and emotional stability. These weren't introduced as dangers, but as modern miracles of science and medicine, respectable, fashionable, and socially accepted. To society, this made difficulties easier to ignore. If someone seemed tired or overwhelmed, they weren't encouraged to slow down or rethink their life. They were encouraged to restore themselves and return to perfection as quickly as possible. The world wanted efficiency, not healing. It wanted a flawless performance, not emotional truth. This subtle dependency wasn't immediate. It was gradual, often unnoticed at first, wrapped in elegance and legitimacy. A small relief here, a bit of support. There's something simply to get through the evening, quiet the anxiety, or maintain composure. People weren't chasing a thrill or looking for danger. They were searching for peace in a world that quietly denied them the right to feel human. What made it even more tragic was how completely normal it all seemed. A small part of the daily routine, hidden behind perfume bottles and jewelry cases, became a quiet anchor that many believed they needed simply to exist in the world they were trapped in. Society preferred not to question this growing reliance. Silence was easier than acknowledgement. If someone appeared cheerful, then they were fine. If they continued to attend events, host dinners, and present themselves gracefully, then nothing was wrong. The outer world saw only beauty, brilliance, and wealth. The inner world, however, carried exhaustion, emotional numbness, and a dependence disguised as sophistication. Young women observed this from childhood. They watched mothers who never complained, yet looked tired behind their eyes. They watched aunts who never expressed anger, yet seemed weighed down by unspoken burdens. They grew up learning that silence was dignity, that suffering quietly was a sign of refinement. They learned that to belong in society meant never letting anyone see when your hands trembled or your heart felt overwhelmed. By the time they became part of high society themselves, they had already learned how to hide their emotions as skillfully as they learned how to dance or smile. Men, too, lived under immense pressure, though theirs came wrapped in the expectation of dominance and unwavering strength. They had responsibilities to uphold traditions, manage estates, protect their family honor, and navigate political and financial turmoil. There was no room for fear or doubt. Society told them they were the guardians of stability, but reality often made them feel just as fragile as anyone else. Yet, they rarely confessed it. They simply continued forward, carrying burdens that no one else was allowed to see. The more society celebrated elegance, the more it ignored reality. The more it worshipped appearances, the more invisible the suffering became. The people inside this glittering world were praised for their beauty, admired for their lifestyle, and envied by outsiders. But beauty cannot erase pressure. Wealth cannot cure loneliness. Luxury cannot replace emotional freedom. And so, the era sparkled brightly, but beneath that sparkle, cracks grew that no one wanted to acknowledge. The elegant rituals continued. The grand parties never stopped. The expectations remained unbroken. But slowly, silently, the people inside this glamorous world lost the space to simply be human. That is what made Edwardian high society both breathtaking and heartbreaking. It wasn't just a world of stunning fashion and dazzling social life. It was a world where emotional freedom was sacrificed for perfection, where quiet suffering was hidden beneath laced gloves and pearl necklaces, and where human vulnerability was disguised beneath elegance so successfully that even history almost forgot to look beneath the surface. Yet, history always listens to what silence tries to hide, and as the era continued, so did the weight, the struggle, and the dependence on anything that could make life feel momentarily manageably then, if only behind closed doors. The world saw elegance. Those living inside it felt something very different. The beauty of Edwardian Europe didn't just sit on the surface, it seeped into everything, like a perfume lingering long after the wearer had left the room. There was a grace in how people walked, a discipline in how they spoke, and precision in every movement. Society looked polished, confident, and dazzling. Yet, the more perfected the performance became, the less room there was for anything real. Perfection left no space for uncertainty, fragility, or emotional truth, and beneath that flawless elegance, an entire generation learned to hide, not only from others, but from themselves. Mourning in high society wasn't peaceful, it was preparation. Curtains were drawn back to reveal carefully curated lives. Servants moved quietly, ensuring the household appeared effortless. Breakfast tables looked luxurious, yet the conversations remained shallow. The day was already choreographed long before it began. Appointments, visits, luncheons, social obligations disguised as pleasure. There was always somewhere to be seen, always someone to impress, always a reputation to protect. Even the silence felt monitored. For many women, the private hours of mourning were often when the exhaustion felt clearest. They were expected to appear radiant, rested, and composed, no matter how heavy their nights felt. They stood before mirrors, not simply to get dressed, but to rebuild the person the world demanded them to be. Each brushstroke of powder was a promise not to crack today. Each carefully adjusted gown was a reminder. You must hold yourself together. Grace wasn't optional. Emotion wasn't permitted. Afternoons brought social visits, carefully structured gatherings where tea was poured with elegance, while every gesture was silently observed. These rooms were calm, refined, and polite. The conversations flowed gracefully, but they floated far above anything truly meaningful. Confessions had no space here, neither did fear. People admired one another while competing silently. Friendships existed, but they were often laced with caution, comparison, and quiet tension. Trust, in many cases, was fragile. Everyone knew that in a world obsessed with reputation, information could become a weapon. In such an environment, emotional fatigue didn't surprise anyone, yet no one named it. Those who felt overwhelmed were simply told they needed to handle life better. Those who broke under pressure were whispered about, not helped. If someone fainted at a gathering, people expressed polite concern. If someone appeared distant or unwell, they said it was nerves or a weak constitution. It was easier to label suffering than to understand it, easier to treat symptoms than to face the truth of societal expectations. Doctors, with the confidence born from trust and status, offered calm assurances. They promised relief, balance, solutions that seemed refined, respectable, and part of modern advancement. Their recommendations slipped seamlessly into elite life, becoming not symbols of danger, but symbols of privilege and sophistication. If a respected physician said something supported serenity or composure, who dared challenge it? This wasn't rebellion against society, it was participation in it. People believed they were simply caring for themselves within the boundaries of their world. Slowly, this quiet support became part of their identity, rather than a form of help. It wove itself into routines, the same way evening gowns and social etiquette did. It became invisible in its familiarity, a normal part of living in a world that demanded so much while offering so little emotional refuge. For many, it provided a brief illusion of control in lives where control was mostly theatrical. Yet, dependence rarely announces itself loudly. It grows quietly, gradually, almost tenderly at first, until one day it becomes undeniable. Some women began to sense this shift long before they could admit it. They noticed how the days felt harder without assistance, how fatigue lingered even when their smiles stayed perfect. They noticed how they no longer simply wanted relief, they relied on it. Still, they did not speak. What would they say? Who would listen without judgment? Who would understand without turning their suffering into scandal? So they remained silent. Their lives continued to move through glittering rooms and glowing evenings. Yet internally they began to live between two selves, the self the world adored, and the self that was quietly struggling. The divide grew wider with time. Meanwhile, younger women entered adulthood believing this was simply how life worked. They admired the dazzling world ahead of them, dreaming of beauty, luxury, and admiration, never seeing the cost hidden underneath. They practiced posture before they practiced honesty. They learned social refinement before they learned emotional resilience. They were groomed to step into lives already heavy with expectation. And the men, they were not spared. They bore pressure differently through ambition, responsibility, financial survival, and societal burden. Their failures were not permitted. Their insecurities were not forgiven. Their exhaustion was not acknowledged. They were expected to stand tall, always. Many did, but strength without softness becomes its own prison. Even those surrounded by wealth sometimes felt profoundly isolated. The most tragic part was how normal it all appeared. Outsiders admired Edwardian Europe as a pinnacle of civilization, wealthy, cultured, polished, and influential. They saw beauty and assumed happiness. They saw wealth and assumed fulfillment. They saw refinement and assumed superiority. But history whispers differently. Behind silk curtains were moments of silent, shaking hands. Behind polished smiles were restless thoughts that refused to quiet. Behind poised laughter were hearts weighed down by expectation and fear. No one ever planned for life to become this complicated. People didn't choose struggle. They simply followed the only path society gave them, one paved beautifully, yet deeply unforgiving. In quiet moments, when the parties ended and the candlelight faded, reality returned like a slow tide. The echo of music disappeared, leaving only silence. The masks slipped, even if only for a moment. People stared into mirrors and saw not the glamorous figure admired by society, but a tired soul trying desperately to hold everything together. Some prayed quietly for strength. Some accepted their life as inescapable. Some pretended nothing was wrong. Some simply endured. The tragedy of Edwardian high society was not that it was dark. It was that it pretended not to be. Its beauty was real. Its elegance was breathtaking. Its culture was remarkable. But beneath all of it lived fragile human beings craving understanding, peace, and emotional space in a world that valued appearances above humanity. And as this era continued forward, the pressure would only grow heavier, dependence would deepen further, and the quiet struggles of the elite would slowly begin shaping destinies in ways no one could yet see. As the Edwardian era marched on, life didn't slow down. It accelerated. Cities shone brighter. Innovations appeared in a constant stream, and society became even more obsessed with the appearance of progress and refinement. Every new invention promised a more convenient life, and every social trend promised greater sophistication. But beneath this relentless forward motion, a quiet emotional unease was growing among the elite. It was like tension building under a beautifully decorated ceiling that no one dared to inspect too closely. People clung to elegance as if it were a suit of armor, believing that beauty alone could shield them from the storms brewing inside their perfectly structured lives. Evenings were still grand spectacles. Orchestras filled glowing halls with music, and laughter floated through air thick with perfume and polished charm. The world looked on, admiring the Edwardian elite as icons of culture and luxury. But few understood the sheer effort required to maintain such flawless grace. The elite were living inside a theater where the curtains never closed, and no one was ever allowed to step backstage. Even within the private sanctuary of their own homes, the pressure lingered like shadows in the corners of every room. There was no escape from judgment, not from society, not from family, and often not even from oneself. Yet, amid this glittering pressure, small cracks in composure began to show. These weren't dramatic breakdowns, but subtle moments, a blank stare during a lively conversation, a hand trembling slightly while lifting a teacup, a smile held just a second too long to hide something unsteady beneath. Those closest to them noticed these signs, but their response was defined by the same silent acceptance that governed their world. Everyone is tired, they would say. Everyone feels the pressure. And so, instead of acknowledging the growing emotional fragility, society normalized it. It wasn't that people lacked compassion. It was that compassion was trapped behind the strict rules of dignity and restraint. Expressing true emotion was considered dangerous, something that could unravel the entire social order. So, instead of talking, people managed. They coped. They endured. Instead of asking difficult questions, they leaned more heavily on the quiet supports presented as solutions. It felt easier. It looked better. It preserved their image. The more this cycle repeated, the more it shaped their very identities. Certain individuals could no longer tell where their true selves ended and their social personas began. They had been performing for so long that authenticity felt foreign, maybe even frightening. Who would they be if they were no longer perfect? Would they still belong? Would anyone still respect them? These unspoken fears silently guided their decisions, behaviors, and dependencies. Women, especially, found themselves trapped between duty and their own inner desires. Many were intelligent, perceptive, and capable of so much more than society permitted. They quietly dreamed of lives where they could speak their minds freely, choose their own paths, and exist without constant performance. But those dreams were usually locked away behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. They learned to suppress their own hearts for the sake of honor, marriage, family expectations, and social approval. Their struggle often manifested in silence rather than rebellion. They weathered emotional storms behind closed doors, only to step into ballrooms with flawless charm. They felt a profound loneliness even while surrounded by admiration. They carried unexpressed sadness beneath their silk gowns and glittering jewels. And as their emotional resilience thinned, their reliance on any form of stability, no matter how fragile, grew stronger. Men, meanwhile, continued to bear the immense weight of financial responsibility, political influence, and social leadership. Their struggles looked different but were just as heavy. Many faced hidden economic uncertainties behind their polished reputations. Businesses fluctuated, political tensions were rising, and the world beyond their luxury estates was changing faster than tradition could comfortably handle. Men felt an intense pressure to appear unbreakable, to carry everything without ever faltering. But unbreakable is a myth. It always has been. It was in the quiet moments late at night, after the parties had ended and the city lights had dimmed, that the truth surfaced most clearly. Silence filled the grand rooms that looked magnificent by day, but felt strangely hollow in the darkness. The chandeliers hung motionless. The furniture sat untouched. The laughter that once filled these spaces disappeared, leaving only echoes behind. And in those silent hours, individuals finally had to face themselves. Some cried quietly where no one could see. Some stared into mirrors, searching for a strength they didn't feel. Some prayed for a peace they could not find. And some just felt numb. No major scandal erupted. No dramatic collapse shook society at this stage. Instead, there was something far more haunting, a slow, emotional erosion. People didn't fall all at once. They faded, gently and silently, invisibly, beneath layers of elegance and respectability. What made the situation even more complicated was that society continued to celebrate these individuals as icons of beauty and success. Newspapers praised their social achievements. Artists painted their portraits. Guests admired their extravagant events. The world applauded what was visible and never questioned what remained hidden. But applause doesn't heal. Admiration doesn't comfort. And prestige does not protect the human heart from exhaustion. The younger generation stepped into this world, inheriting not options, but expectations. They learned early on that emotional truth must be kept quiet, while presentation must always be loud. They were raised not only to live in society, but to endure it, to protect their reputation at all costs, to accept that silence was strength, composure was survival, and vulnerability was unacceptable. This cultural mindset shaped entire families. Conversations carefully avoided emotional honesty. Parenting emphasized discipline and refinement above all else. Love was present, but often restrained. Affection existed, but often went unspoken. Children grew up seeing their parents as statues of perfection, rather than as human beings who feared and struggled just like everyone else. And so, the cycle of suppressed truth continued. By now, what had begun as an occasional reliance on social remedies had transitioned into something woven deeply into the patterns of their lives. It wasn't celebrated or bragged about. It was simply there, quiet, hidden, and accepted. A tool people believed they needed to function in a world that never permitted them to rest emotionally. The tragedy wasn't recklessness. It was survival disguised as sophistication. But history has a way of revealing what society tries so hard to hide. Looking back, we don't just see glamour, we see fragility wrapped in silk. We see resilience forced into silence. We see emotional lives bending under a pressure they were never allowed to acknowledge. And that is where this story gains its haunting power, not in scandal, but in humanity. Edwardian society glimmered with unmatched elegance. Yes, it produced culture, beauty, art, and progress. But it also produced quiet suffering. It demanded emotional sacrifice in exchange for social acceptance. It built palaces of pride on foundations of unspoken strain. And as the years continued, those foundations would be tested more deeply than ever before. Because every era that refuses to confront the truth eventually finds itself standing face to face with it. And Edwardian Europe, beneath its chandeliers and velvet, was slowly heading toward that inevitable reckoning. The carriages rolled softly over London's midnight streets, as if the wheels themselves were afraid to make noise. Lamps glimmered behind velvet curtains, music floated from gilded drawing rooms, and beneath every polished surface lurked a truth society would never confess. By the time Edwardian Europe reached this moment, the facade was already cracking. Doctors still called the white powder medicinal. Society ladies whispered it was merely a nervous tonic, and men in power insisted it was nothing more than a fashionable indulgence. But behind those comforting lies were trembling hands, restless hearts, and lives slowly unraveling under shadow. In those quiet, expensive rooms, the story wasn't about dramatic chaos or street-level ruin. It was subtler, more elegant, and infinitely more tragic. Addiction in high society did not shout it, whispered. It appeared in the gentle sigh before a hostess smiled at her guests, in the slightly too wide eyes of a duchess pretending calm, in the smooth confidence of a politician masking sleepless nights with exquisite tailoring. The danger was wrapped in silk, hidden under lace gloves, disguised with laughter and manners, and protected by enormous wealth. That made it harder to recognize, easier to deny, and far more devastating when the truth finally broke through. Part 5 of this tale settles deeper into that world, where reputation mattered more than truth, and appearances meant everything. The Edwardian elite lived in a society obsessed with perfection, perfect posture, perfect dinner settings, perfect conversation, perfect control. But addiction has no respect for elegance. It crept into palaces and private clubs, into carriages and opera boxes, into bedrooms with embroidered pillows, and into the minds of men and women who believed themselves untouchable. The higher the status, the greater the pressure. And the greater the pressure, the more desperately people searched for escape. And escape always comes with a price. This wasn't escapism out of rebellion or thrill-seeking. It was born from fear of social failure, fear of emotional exposure, fear of scandal, fear of collapsing under impossible expectations. A duchess was expected to host flawlessly, a society beauty to dazzle endlessly, a politician to perform tirelessly. When human limits clashed with these demands, people reached for anything that promised relief. Doctors spoke soothing assurances, advertisements promised energy and confidence, and pharmacists sold hope in delicate bottles. No one used the word addiction yet, no one dared, but the signs were everywhere. Servants noticed first, as they always did. They saw the lady of the house pacing at night instead of sleeping, noticed medicines refilled far too quickly, saw the subtle tremor in a gentleman's hand as he pretended calm over breakfast. Whispered conversations began behind kitchen doors and in servant corridors. "Madam seems nervous lately. Sir hasn't eaten properly in days." But servants had no power to intervene. Their entire world depended on silence. Protecting the family's image was as important as polishing the silver. Meanwhile, society gossip thrived, but selectively. No one whispered, "She is struggling." They whispered, "She's acting strangely." It wasn't concern, it was curiosity, not compassion and entertainment. Reputation was both armor and prison. A faint rumor could damage a family name for generations, and so, families hid everything. They sent relatives away under vague excuses: a rest cure, a nervous holiday, a change of air, phrases designed to sound respectable while disguising quiet desperation. Doctors complied, society accepted the euphemisms, and the truth sank deeper into silence. Within that silence, individuals felt increasingly isolated. They lived in golden cages with velvet bars, wealthy, admired, beautifully dressed, yet terrified of being truly seen. That fear fueled dependence. Nights without sleep turned into a pattern. A reliance began to grow, and soon the occasional relief became something their bodies demanded. But denial remained powerful. As long as dresses sparkled, as long as men conducted business successfully, as long as dinner parties dazzled guests, people convinced themselves everything was under control. Control was the great illusion of Edwardian elegance. Everything appeared effortless, and showing the effort itself was considered vulgar. But slowly, quietly, the consequences began to show. Tempers shortened behind closed doors. Emotional distance spread within marriages that were already built more on duty than affection. Promises were broken privately, while public promises continued flawlessly. The mind, overstimulated and exhausted, began to wander into shadows. Anxiety turned sharper, melancholy grew heavier, and yet, morning always demanded perfection again. Faces were powdered, hair arranged, smiles rehearsed. Society applauded their grace, unaware or unwilling to admit that beneath the surface, many of its brightest stars were struggling simply to hold themselves together. The most heartbreaking part was how normal it all felt within that world. When everyone around you is quietly coping the same way, it doesn't feel like a crisis, it feels like culture. Just another fashionable habit, just another secret of the elite. And the more normalized it became, the deeper the silent suffering spread. These people were not villains. They were not reckless thrill-seekers. They were human beings living inside a system that demanded perfection without mercy. And when society refuses to allow vulnerability, it creates a world where people suffer beautifully, silently, and alone until silence can no longer hold everything inside. As Edwardian Europe glittered with grand balls, horse-drawn elegance, and aristocratic charm, a parallel reality existed beneath it: exhaustion, pressure, fear, and a carefully concealed dependence on something they believed helped them survive. The contrast made the tragedy sharper. How strange that in an age of opulence, so many hearts lived on the edge of collapse, and how fitting, perhaps, that history remembers the beauty first, long before it dares to acknowledge the quiet human cost hidden inside the silk and satin of those unforgettable years. Night in Edwardian Europe was never truly silent. Even when the music faded and the last carriage rolled away from the grand driveways, something still lingered in the air, an invisible tension, a quiet restlessness. Welcome to Part 6. Tonight we go deeper into that silence, into the late hours, when the chandeliers were finally dark, when servants had retreated to their quarters, when laughter had evaporated from polished walls, and when people were left alone with their thoughts. This was the hour when the masks slipped, when confidence faded, when elegance could no longer hide the tremor inside the soul. Behind closed doors, the real battles began. A duchess, who had dazzled guests all evening, would now sit before her mirror, staring at her reflection with eyes that felt unfamiliar. The same mirror that earlier praised her beauty now reflected only exhaustion. Her pearls no longer looked like symbols of grace. They felt like chains of expectation wrapped around her neck. She would remove each piece of jewelry slowly, not with relief, but with unease, as if taking off her public identity left her too exposed, too real, too human. And being human in her world was the most frightening thing of all. In gentlemen's clubs and private studies, the story wasn't much different. Men who commanded attention in Parliament or ruled vast business empires during the day found themselves pacing restlessly across expensive rugs at night. Their power did not help them in these quiet hours. Status could not steady the mind. Success could not give rest to a heart weighed down by pressure. A man might pour himself a drink, open a file, and stare at it for minutes without reading a single word. He would then close it again, pretending he was simply tired, never admitting to himself that what he felt was not tiredness, but an invisible storm raging within. It was during these late hours that dependence grew stronger, not dramatically, not with reckless abandon, but slowly, subtly, almost politely. It was a whisper in the mind that said, "Just tonight, just this once more." The voice was gentle, reasonable, and persuasive. It never sounded dangerous, and because society itself had not yet truly condemned these habits, people convinced themselves they were behaving responsibly. After all, they still functioned, they still dressed perfectly, they still fulfilled their duties, so how could anything be wrong? That was the tragedy, the quiet danger wrapped in reassurance. Morning still came, as it always did, indifferent to human struggle, but waking up began to feel different, not refreshing, not hopeful, more like surviving another round. A society lady would rise with a practiced smile already forming, because she knew her day was not her own. It belonged to her schedule, to expectation, to reputation. Breakfast would be beautifully arranged. The sunlight would fall gently across polished tables. Everything looked perfect. Yet beneath that calm surface, 1,000 anxieties stirred. What if she faltered today? What if her composure broke in front of others? What if someone noticed something wasn't quite right? It was fear, not vanity, that kept her performing flawlessly. Meanwhile, conversations across Europe were slowly beginning to shift. A few doctors whispered doubts to one another. A few articles cautiously questioned long-trusted remedies. But any suggestion that the elite might be struggling was uncomfortable for society to accept. It was easier to believe that struggle belonged elsewhere, to poorer neighborhoods, to different social classes, to places less decorated and less admired. The idea that the most privileged people in the world were quietly suffering did not fit the grand narrative of elegance and control that Edwardian society loved to believe about itself. So, the doubt was pushed aside, and the silence continued. Inside families, however, that silence was no longer peaceful. Husbands and wives, who were often already distant because their marriages were built more on duty than deep emotional understanding, now found themselves drifting further apart. One might notice the other growing withdrawn, irritable, or strangely restless. Questions formed but were rarely asked directly. Instead came soft remarks like, "You seem tired lately," or "Perhaps you should rest more." Conversations touched the edges of the truth, but never dared to step into it. Real honesty would mean confronting vulnerability, and vulnerability was something this era had never been taught to handle gently. Children, though not always understanding the details, sensed the change too. They noticed when their mother hugged them just a little too tightly, as if trying to steady herself through their presence. They noticed when their father stared into empty space longer than usual, when his laughter felt forced, or when the warmth in the household shifted from natural to carefully maintained. Children have always been silent witnesses to adult worlds, feeling the storms long before they understand them, and in these homes, many young hearts grew up learning that appearances mattered more than emotional truth. Throughout all of this, the servants remained the quiet keepers of reality. They saw what no guest ever would: the exhaustion behind the beauty, the crisis hidden under etiquette, the moments of weakness cleaned away before dawn. But they carried these truths silently, bound not only by duty but by compassion. Many felt genuine concern. They wanted to help. Yet they lived in a world where crossing the line between servant and protector could cost them everything. So they did the only thing they could. They cared quietly, they supported subtly, and they watched closely, hoping that things might someday change. And yet, in all this darkness, something else began to grow too: awareness. The first cracks in denial were not loud. They were gentle, human, and emotional. A moment when someone finally admitted to themselves, "I am not fine." A privateer, a trembling breath, a realization that elegance has limits, that strength does not mean never struggling, and that wealth cannot buy inner peace. These moments did not yet transform society, but they mattered deeply. They were the beginning of truth, quietly waking beneath layers of silence. This part of our story lives in this fragile space, between silence and awakening. It shows a world desperately trying to remain perfect, while quietly falling apart from within. It reminds us that behind history's glamour, there were real human beings with fears, insecurities, and hearts that could hurt just like anyone else's. Edwardian Europe wanted to be remembered for its beauty, its refinement, its grace, and it is. But beneath that memory lies another story of emotional battles fought alone, of quiet suffering wrapped in silk, and of a society beginning, very slowly, to realize that even the most polished lives can be touched by struggle. Thank you for watching. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know that reaching out is a sign of strength. Help is available. By the time we reach this next chapter of the story, something subtle but important has shifted in Edwardian Europe. The world of glittering halls, carefully arranged smiles, and perfectly rehearsed manners is still standing, still beautiful, still convincing to anyone looking from the outside. But inside that polished world, awareness has begun to stir like a faint breeze in a sealed room. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. Part 7 lives inside this gentle awakening, where denial starts to weaken and truth begins to feel less frightening. Late evenings still bring silence to grand houses, but it is no longer the same silence. Before, silence meant pressure, it meant hiding, it meant pretending nothing was wrong. Now, in some rooms, silence becomes a space to think honestly for the first time. A lady who once rushed to distract herself now sits still and simply breathes, feeling the weight she has been carrying instead of pushing it away. There is fear in acknowledging reality, yes, but there is also relief. And somewhere deep inside, she begins to feel the faintest sense of strength in honesty. In private studies and gentlemen's lounges, the first small conversations begin. Not public ones, not risky, reputation-damaging ones, just quiet exchanges between trusted friends. One man finally says, "Life feels heavier than people think." Another nods, surprised by how comforting it is to hear someone else admit the same thing. Slowly, walls built from pride, pressure, and expectation begin to loosen. Doctors of the era, too, continue to observe with growing curiosity. Some begin to write more seriously in medical journals, questioning old assumptions and gently suggesting that emotional and mental well-being deserve real attention, not dismissal. These early medical voices are cautious, but determined. They are not trying to shame anyone. They are trying to understand. Within families, the emotional climate also begins to change. Wives who once hid every worry from their husbands now allow themselves to show a little vulnerability. Husbands who once buried all pressure inside begin to admit that their responsibilities weigh on them more than people realize. There are still misunderstandings. There are still emotional distances shaped by years of formality and social roles. But new connections start forming: small gestures, softer tones, genuine concern replacing rehearsed politeness. For the first time, some families begin to feel like real emotional units rather than public partnerships. Children observe this shift as well. They may not know exactly what is wrong or what has changed, but they sense something gentler in the air. Parents speak to them with slightly more warmth, with fewer rigid expectations, and a little more patience. Instead of being raised only to maintain image and reputation, a few children begin to receive something deeper: empathy. Moments of real affection start to shine through the strictness of Edwardian parenting norms. And even small changes like these shape how the next generation will think and feel. Servants, always the silent observers of household reality, notice this too. In some homes, they see less tension in the routines they repeat daily. They notice softer voices, fewer arguments muffled behind closed doors, and more genuine thank yous offered instead of cold instructions. While many households remain unchanged, others begin to feel slightly warmer, more human, less rigidly controlled by societal pressure. Servants, who often carried emotional concern quietly in their hearts, feel a sense of cautious hope. If the people who held power in these grand homes could learn to acknowledge their struggles, perhaps life within these walls might become a kinder experience for everyone living inside them. Meanwhile, society itself is slowly, almost reluctantly, learning to see the difference between image and reality. Newspapers occasionally hint that even the highest circles of society are not immune to emotional strain. A few social commentators cautiously discuss that elegance does not equal happiness, that great wealth brings its own intense pressures, and that human hearts do not become stronger simply because they are dressed in silk. These ideas are new, uncomfortable, and often resisted, but the fact that they are being spoken at all means progress is happening. And yet, despite this progress, it is important to remember that Edwardian society does not transform overnight. Many people still cling tightly to old expectations. Many still believe that emotional struggle should remain hidden forever. Many still choose silence over honesty. But the difference now is that silence no longer feels like the only option. A door that was once sealed has cracked open. Light has begun to filter through. Once people taste truth, even in small amounts, it becomes harder to go back to complete denial. Part 7 captures this fragile but powerful turning point. It shows how change often begins, not with loud revolutions or dramatic declarations, but with quiet realizations, gentle courage, and private honesty. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by wars, political events, and visible transformation. Sometimes history changes because hearts change, because minds start asking different questions, because people begin to value their humanity over their image. This phase of Edwardian Europe is deeply human. It is about people learning to face themselves without fear. It is about acknowledging that elegance, beauty, and reputation cannot replace emotional well-being. It is about society beginning, slowly and uncertainly, to understand that beneath every grand facade lives a real person with real feelings. And when truth starts to be accepted instead of hidden, something powerful happens. Not chaos, not collapse, but quiet healing. As we move into this next part of the story, the world of Edwardian Europe still glows with chandeliers, polished silver, and carefully arranged elegance. But now that faint thread of honesty running beneath everything begins to grow stronger. Part 8 lives in the space where realization starts to turn into slow change, where people do not simply feel differently, but begin to live differently, even if only in small, tentative ways. The beauty of Edwardian society remains, but it no longer feels quite as hollow. Something deeper begins to breathe beneath the surface. Evenings still arrive with their familiar rituals, gowns carefully chosen, social gatherings attended, conversations filled with politeness and subtle competition. But inside the minds of many, these moments no longer feel like cages. For some, they now feel like stages they are choosing to step onto, rather than obligations they are trapped in. A lady who once felt terrified of imperfection now reminds herself that she does not have to be flawless to deserve respect. She begins to smile in a way that feels more real, less rehearsed. She laughs, not because etiquette expects it, but because she actually finds joy in a moment. This may sound small, but for someone who once lived entirely under pressure, it is quietly revolutionary. In private rooms, where struggles once hid in complete silence, gentle conversations begin to take shape. A husband sits beside his wife, not as a symbol of social success, but simply as a companion. Instead of asking, "Are you ready for tomorrow's event?" he asks, "How are you truly feeling lately?" She hesitates at first, because honesty still feels risky, but then words begin to come carefully, softly, but sincerely. For the first time, they talk like two human beings sharing a life, not two figures performing roles assigned by society. The room where silence once felt heavy now feels surprisingly warm. Doctors continue to observe, write, and learn. A few of them start encouraging rest, not merely as physical relaxation, but as emotional care. They begin suggesting that exhaustion is not weakness. They gently encourage patients to value balance rather than relentless perfection. Their understanding is still imperfect. They are at the early edge of what future generations will know much better, but their effort matters. They are among the first to treat emotional well-being as something worthy of care, not shame. The seeds of future mental health awareness are being planted quietly in these scholarly papers, private consultations, and careful observations. Society's conversations also continue to evolve. Where whispers once carried only judgment, they now sometimes carry understanding. People begin admitting, even if only in private circles, that life in high society is not as effortless as it appears. Magazines and writers occasionally explore themes of emotional strain beneath glamorous lives, and those reading such words feel something unexpected. Recognition. They realize they are not alone, and feeling less alone brings comfort that no luxury could ever purchase. Within families, relationships continue to shift slowly but meaningfully. Parents spend a little more time actually listening instead of merely instructing. Some mothers who once followed strict emotional distance now allow tenderness to guide them a little more. Some fathers, long taught to hide every inner struggle, begin to show gentleness instead of only discipline. Homes that once felt coldly perfect begin to carry warmth created not by wealth, but by emotional connection. Children grow up witnessing something rare for their time. Adults admitting feelings without shame. Adults showing care without fear of appearing weak. These children will remember that, and the world they build later will not be quite so trapped in silence. Servants, whose lives were woven into the daily rhythms of these households, notice more than anyone how much has subtly changed. The tension they once sensed in every quiet corridor softened slightly. Instructions are sometimes given with kindness instead of rigid formality. A simple thank you carries real sincerity instead of automatic politeness. Some servants begin to feel that they are working not only in a grand house, but in a home where humanity is finally allowed to exist alongside elegance. Of course, not everyone changes. There are still households clinging stubbornly to old, silent perfection. There are still individuals unwilling to admit vulnerability. There are still circles of society where reputation matters more than emotional truth. But those places now stand in contrast to a growing number of lives quietly shifting toward honesty. And in history, even small cultural shifts matter deeply, because they are the beginning of future transformation. Outside these homes, the world itself is changing too. Edwardian Europe stands close to the edge of a new era, without even realizing how near it is to massive global change. Technology is advancing, ideas are evolving. The rigid structure of class and social expectation is already beginning to loosen. This quiet emotional awakening is part of that broader transformation. Society is learning something powerful, that human beings, regardless of wealth or status, share the same inner struggles, fears, hopes, and emotional needs. Part 8 captures the gentle rise of hope. It shows what happens after fear begins to fade, and before life forces the world into dramatic shifts. It is a period of soft strength found not in outward displays of power, but in inward honesty, compassion, and understanding. It reminds us that the greatest changes in history sometimes start quietly, inside hearts, rather than in public speeches or grand events. In this stage of Edwardian life, elegance does not disappear. It simply becomes less of a mask and more of a setting in which real people live. Behind silk curtains and polished mirrors, human hearts begin to beat more freely, less burdened by secrecy and impossible standards. The story moves forward not with noise, but with calm determination. As a society slowly learns that true dignity does not come from pretending perfection, it comes from allowing humanity to exist, even in the grandest rooms. Welcome back to our journey. In Part 9, we find ourselves deep within an Edwardian world that, while still shimmering with grandeur, is undergoing a profound and quiet transformation. The glittering surface of society has long concealed the immense pressure of silent struggle, a burden carried by generations. But now, the grip of that silence is beginning to loosen. It's not a sudden, dramatic shift happening everywhere at once, but rather a series of small, meaningful changes that are starting to ripple outward. The very idea that composure must be an unbreakable suit of armor is being questioned. People who once wore their dignity like a shield are discovering that admitting fear, acknowledging fatigue, or expressing uncertainty doesn't erase their worth. In fact, they are learning that vulnerability doesn't diminish elegance, it deepens it. Within the private chambers of stately homes, the old patterns of life persist, but they are increasingly interrupted by small, courageous acts of honesty. A lady who once hid her trembling hands beneath delicate lace gloves might now allow herself a quiet moment in a corner, letting her thoughts settle instead of forcing a smile for onlookers. A gentleman, accustomed to burying his exhaustion beneath a perfectly tailored coat and a firm, confident handshake, might now pause during a conversation. He might take a deep breath, speak more plainly, and even admit that the weight of life feels heavy. These moments, though brief and fleeting, are monumental. They represent a subtle rebellion against an entire culture built on the illusion of effortless perfection, a culture that demanded its members appear flawless at all times. This quiet revolution is also reshaping family life. Conversations that were once rigid and scripted are becoming more reflective, more human. A mother, instead of simply rehearsing lessons on proper etiquette, might now ask her child what truly excites them, what they dream about. A father, long cast in the role of an unassailable authority figure, might now speak not from a pedestal, but as someone who listens, who validates emotion, and who acknowledges struggle without attaching shame to it. Children, observing these subtle but powerful shifts, are absorbing a new kind of strength. It's a courage based not on hiding one's true self, but on honesty, empathy, and genuine connection. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the next generation is beginning to imagine a world where being human doesn't conflict with being respectable, where one's inner life is as important as one's public persona. Beyond the home, the grand societal circles are also registering these changes. The magnificent parties and lavish balls continue, filling the nights with music and light. But within them, a new element is emerging. Manners are starting to include genuine warmth. Small, spontaneous acts of kindness are becoming more common, and amidst the polite chatter, you can now find glimpses of real, heartfelt conversation. Where decorum once demanded strict attention to hierarchy and propriety, some gatherings now allow for moments of curiosity, sincerity, and even compassion to slip through the cracks. These are not sweeping revolutionary changes. They are almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but they ripple outward, like stones dropped in a still pond, slowly softening the rigid, unforgiving edges of the world and creating space for a more authentic way of being. Parallel to these personal awakenings, medical understanding is also evolving. Doctors are beginning to cautiously publish insights suggesting that emotional and mental health deserves serious attention. They are starting to argue that exhaustion, anxiety, and inner strain are not character flaws but are, in fact, human realities that require care and compassion, not judgment. Pharmacists and other practitioners are recognizing the limitations of purely physical remedies. The growing realization is that no powder, potion, or prescription can serve as a substitute for genuine emotional balance. True relief, people are discovering, is not always found in a bottle or a complex treatment. Sometimes, it is found in the simple, profound acceptance of one's own humanity, with all its imperfections and vulnerabilities. Even within the grandest estates, among the household staff, these changes are noticed. The servants, who move through the corridors like silent observers, sense a shift in the atmosphere. Orders are given more softly, with less of a demanding edge. Expressions of thanks are more frequent and feel more genuine. The heavy, tense silences that once hung in the air, thick with unspoken despair, are now less common. The invisible threads of anxiety that had been woven through the very fabric of these homes, through the ballrooms, and the private studies are loosening. In their place, there is a lighter air. People laugh more freely, they sigh more openly, and they occasionally allow themselves to rest without the familiar pang of guilt. There's a cautious but meaningful recognition that human emotion can, and should, exist alongside social grace. Of course, not all shadows have vanished. There are still houses where expectation rules with an iron fist, where appearances are everything, and where exhaustion is carefully masked behind a flawless facade. There are still individuals who cling fiercely to the old ways, terrified of what might happen if they were to admit any weakness. They see vulnerability not as a strength, but as a catastrophic failure. But the critical difference now is that the cracks in this old, rigid system are visible. People are noticing that others are beginning to speak, to care, to acknowledge the struggles of their peers, And once those cracks appear, even the most seemingly unbreakable walls begin to shift. The illusion of universal, effortless perfection has been broken, and there is no going back. By this stage in our story, Edwardian society stands at a fascinating threshold. The elegance remains, the traditions persist, and history will forever remember this era for its undeniable glamour and style. But beneath all that sparkle, a quiet revolution of the heart is well underway. People are learning a profound lesson, that being human, being vulnerable, does not diminish their worth, it enhances it. They are beginning to see that compassion, understanding, and honesty are not weaknesses incompatible with refinement. In fact, they are discovering that these qualities are the truest and most enduring markers of strength. Part 9 captures this delicate, transformative moment in all its subtlety. It's a reminder that the most profound changes are often the ones that are invisible to the outside world. They occur not on public stages, but inside quiet rooms that history books will never write about, and inside human hearts that no one will ever publicly measure. The Edwardian elite may continue to sparkle for society, to play their roles in the grand theatre of public life. But behind the heavy silk curtains, a new kind of courage is emerging. It is the courage to be real, the courage to admit struggle, the courage to live as a human being first, and as a social icon second. And in that quiet courage lies the beginning of something truly lasting, a subtle, emotional awakening that no social expectation, no matter how powerful, can ever fully erase. The story of Edwardian Europe often ends with its dazzling spectacle, but its true conclusion lies in something quieter, a subtle awakening that threaded through the grand lives of its elite. Society continued to shine, ballrooms glittered, orchestras played, and silk gowns rustled, but beneath the surface, a new awareness began to take hold, an awareness that perfection, no matter how flawlessly presented, could not shield the human heart from fatigue, fear, or longing. It was the understanding that these carefully constructed facades, while brilliant, concealed something fragile, something intensely real. And in this growing awareness, lives began to shift in ways that mattered far more than any ball, gown, or title ever could. Private moments, once filled with silent tension, now held the possibility of genuine understanding. A woman might pause before her mirror, not to force her reflection to meet society's demands, but to simply allow herself to breathe, to feel, to just be. A man might leave his study, not only to fulfill a duty, but to connect with his family, to acknowledge the strain they all silently shared. Conversations started to become more honest, not reckless, but deliberate, empathetic, grounded in the quiet recognition that no social mask was worth sacrificing one's emotional well-being. Even the smallest acts, an unforced laugh, a sincere embrace, a shared sigh of relief, became revolutionary gestures in a world that had long demanded constant composure. Across grand households, even the servants perceived these changes with careful optimism. The palpable tension that once filled corridors began to ease. Whispered instructions, once rigid and exact, were now tempered with a newfound patience. Quiet gratitude began to replace perfunctory acknowledgments, and the children, always so sensitive to the emotional currents around them, started growing up in spaces where vulnerability was not punished, but cautiously accepted. These small, incremental shifts, though subtle, rippled outward, affecting not just individuals, but the very culture that had raised them. This wasn't just a social shift. It was echoed in the world of medicine. A few forward-thinking practitioners began to write more openly about the importance of emotional health. They suggested that true resilience wasn't built through suppression, but through support, awareness, and compassionate care. Their words were tentative, their research just beginning, but they were planting the seeds for future generations. Slowly, society began to see that elegance alone could not define a fulfilled life. They were learning that physical beauty, immense wealth, and high status could never replace emotional balance or simple human compassion. And yet, even as this awareness grew, the shadows of the old world remained. The immense pressures of expectation were not gone. Deep-rooted traditions continued, and old habits lingered. Some individuals clung desperately to the belief that strength meant never faltering, that reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. But the critical difference now was the existence of choice. People could finally see other ways of being. They could witness courage not in grand declarations, but in small, authentic moments. They began to understand that vulnerability did not destroy dignity, it enhanced it, made it more human. The most remarkable transformation, though, was internal. The people of this era began the difficult work of reconciling their polished external lives with their inner truths. They discovered that the world didn't have to know every struggle for that struggle to be valid. They learned that acknowledging hardship privately could be just as empowering as any public triumph. Elegance no longer felt like heavy armor. Instead, it became a stage upon which human hearts could live authentically, even if the audience didn't fully see the performance behind the mask. Strength was redefined. It was no longer the absence of fear, but the quiet acceptance of it. History remembers Edwardian Europe for its beauty, its sophistication, its iconic style. But beneath that remembered glamour lies this other story, one of quiet endurance, of hidden struggle, of private awakening. It is a story of human beings learning, in the midst of immense pressure, an expectation that true resilience is found not in flawless performance, but in honesty, empathy, and self-recognition. And it is a story that continues to echo today, reminding us that behind every historical facade lies a human heart seeking understanding, compassion, and the courage to simply be. By the end of this era, the world of chandeliers, silk, and social spectacle remained as dazzling as ever. Yet, in private rooms and hidden corridors, something far more enduring had taken root: the quiet knowledge that life, no matter how polished, is lived most fully when hearts are allowed to speak, when fear is acknowledged, and when humanity is embraced above all else. It is in these unseen moments, this delicate intersection of elegance and emotional truth, that Edwardian Europe truly reveals its legacy, not only as a time of breathtaking beauty, but as a profound testament to the quiet, unyielding resilience of the human spirit. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this look into the hidden side of history, please like and subscribe for more stories.